Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for coming on this day of recovery from bad weather here in sunny Washington. I'm honored to be here and to try to moderate this discussion on the QDR. For the administration, this is an opportunity to sync budgetary reality with strategic reality. And there are a lot of interesting phrases the administration uses throughout the document between balance and rebalance. I sort of lost count on how many times balance and rebalance, and that we're balancing back into the balance and all that kind of stuff that we heard. But also innovation and pressing the case on why it's important to do things differently in the environment that we're in, which is still high threat. And I thought, interestingly, in the chairman's risk assessment, which is also a fascinating part of the document, at the back of it, where General Dempsey sort of, Americans in their mental eye want to see ourselves as preeminent, and he said that the next 10 years is going to be dicey technologically and for a lot of other reasons. So for that, also frames some of the risks that we're taking and some of the budget cuts and the trade-offs we're going to make and the stakes for getting it wrong. In the past 24 hours, however, since the QDR was released, we've seen sort of repeated reminders that the world remains a dangerous place. Crisis in the Ukraine obviously continues with reports that pro-Russian forces have seized parts of two Ukrainian missile bases as the West debates and foreign ministers in Paris try to figure out how best to punish Moscow or to change its course of behavior in a crisis that's being described as the worst since the end of the Cold War. Russia tested its RS-12M Topol missile, 6,200-mile ICBM from a mobile launcher, and the North Koreans as well fired off a volley of missiles as a reminder that Pyongyang still exists and can reach out and touch you if it wants to. And Beijing also announced a defense budget, a 12.2% defense budget increase to $135 billion, the latest in a series of double-digit increases with a focus on maritime power, that the Pentagon and most analysts say may actually be half as much as the amount that Beijing is actually spending on defense spending. And as you can imagine, the yuan buys probably more defense capability at this point than the dollar does in their economy. And it's against this backdrop that the administration is releasing its QDR, which is congressionally mandated assessment and a blueprint for spending over the coming 4 years. And there are folks who are looking at this and saying, well, this is a sign of American withdrawal, that there's this, they're having to make these trade-offs, they're making these cuts, and obviously that's a question that allies are wrestling with. By my count, this is the 7th QDR or similar review that started with the 93 bottom-up review as the Pentagon. Hello? Oh, there I am. Sorry, I briefly dropped out. Not that would have changed the course of the discussion, perhaps, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and actually you could argue probably the 8th if you look at the defense guidance, defense strategic guidance, which is sort of a QDR. But over the years, QDR has been roundly derided, more so, I think, in recent years, as trying to be too much, with each of the services particularly fighting to justify their own program interests or strategic interests by fighting really hard to get a line in there. That line justifies, my pet project. And by trying to be all things to all people, the QDR is said, to be a catch-all, prompting Dr. Tony Cordesman, the Arleigh Burke Chair at CSIS and General Cartwright's colleague and one of Washington's top defense minds, to label the QDR a colostomy bag, one of the more colorful descriptions I've heard, and happy to have you guys channel your inner Cordesman a little bit later on what you think.
8 in the morning. Huh? But 8 in the morning, you got it later on.
I'm sorry, it was too good not to use. Although I do apologize for the early bringing up of that imagery. But when I did talk to Dr. Cordesman, about it, and the line he used with me was, a list of 70 intentions, goals, and ideas. I expect it will be a list of 70 goals, intentions, goals, and ideas, but most important question of this particular QDR is, how does this QDR different from every other QDR? And I'm afraid the answer is not enough, which is a big part of the problem as far as he's concerned. For the administration, they would disagree, arguing that the 2010 QDR was a war-focused one. The document itself even says that the focus was very much on Afghanistan, while this is the first QDR that looks beyond Afghanistan, building on the principles set out by the administration in its 2012 defense strategic guidance. Again, a QDR of sorts. So, as this panel requires no introduction whatsoever, I want to, welcome you all. Thank you very much, and ask you to talk about, to give us some thoughts and what you liked and did not like about this QDR. Barry?
Thanks, Vago, and thanks everyone. General Cartwright and I have both had the pleasure of running QDRs, and so
That's a pleasure.
that word was in quotes. The three main questions I think that are worth asking when assessing these is, first, does the strategy sort of match the way the world is headed? Second, do the forces and capabilities support the strategy? And then third, do the resources for defense support the forces and capabilities? And there's no one set of forces and capabilities that match any one strategy. It's a loosely coupled system, but I think those are the sort of key questions that I think of, and there's certainly some great people on this panel to address a couple of them. Matt knows better than anyone where the world's headed, and Steve knows better than almost anyone sort of the status of resources, so I'll sort of go lightly on those. In terms of the strategy fitting the world, I think it's fine, about as reasonably structured for addressing the priority challenges as you could expect from a very large bureaucracy in terms of, in particular, attending to the changes in the world. As expected, I think it's a little better on the nation-state challenges, for example, China, than it is on dealing with some of the new non-state challenges, which I'll sort of end on a little bit. I think the biggest problem today with the strategy is deterrence, for two reasons. One, the Obama track record on this is getting worse sort of by the year and by the month in some ways. Enough said on that. But second, I think the continuing force cuts in light of the first point means that adversaries may be emboldened a bit more than they otherwise would be. And I think some of our allies feel somewhat insecure. So just saying the word deterrence isn't going to do as much as actually making it clear how you're going to underwrite this concept in the strategy. Finally, on the strategy point, if Russia sends forces into eastern Ukraine, this strategy is pretty much dead, because that means, in my view, it means a much more insecure Europe. The Pentagon has had the luxury of sort of treating Europe as a theater for sourcing capabilities and not as a threat or challenge-driven theater. If that happens, we're going to need to go for more resources. I think it becomes a very different security environment. So this is sort of on the razor's edge, this strategy. On the question of forces and capabilities and whether they look sufficient for the strategy, broadly, I think it was appropriate to cut the ground forces back towards pre-9/11 levels. They grew the most in the war on terror for obvious reasons. A key question that I think is pointed out in the document is, how can we regenerate the forces expeditiously if needed? And this is, an obvious risk area that needs monitoring. I think there's two types of decisions here too on capabilities and forces. One is force employment, and one is force development, and I'll address those in turn. Force employment is sort of a little appreciated lever that the Secretary of Defense has. We have forces engaging all over the world. We have fewer forces than we used to. So we really need to preserve their engagement activities for the highest priority efforts. And a Secretary of Defense can really set tough priorities if he or she chooses, and can actually work with the regional commanders to say, it's time to divest of some of your engagement activities to focus on the really important stuff. And I think there's also some opportunities coordinating more with allies. A lot of our allies in Europe, for example, also engage in Africa. Well, why don't we work with them to coordinate a little more closely? And some countries can play larger roles in some of those, in some African countries, and some can play smaller roles, and we can coordinate. But as far as I know, there's no place yet where the U.S. and its allies coordinate about security cooperation. There's no clearinghouse, and I think NATO could provide a platform for such coordination that would help to economize our efforts. On force development, there are long timelines, as many of you know, from concept to fielded equipment in terms of the capabilities that we procure. And the way I think about this question is each Secretary of Defense makes decisions on future capabilities that are for their successors to enjoy or to be able to wield as instruments. And so the decisions in the late 1970s, for example, led to the stealth capabilities and the ISR capabilities that were very instrumental in our success in the 1991 Gulf War. So I think the key questions for this QDR, and I think the jury's out on them, but I would welcome a conversation, is what are Secretary Hagel's legacy capabilities to his successors in 2024, 2029? And I sort of raised 3 questions that I think are going to be more prominent going forward than they have been up to this point. Number 1, will his decisions leave capabilities for future secretaries to deal with a loose nukes crisis, for example, as Pakistan disintegrates? Will we have capabilities to detect nuclear materials, from longer distances, for example? Second, will they enable capabilities to deal with the age of biotech, which I think is pretty much upon us, and I think is a potential major threat in the medium term? And then another example is just space capabilities, where I think we're highly reliant, which is less appreciated than it should be, and I think we're somewhat more vulnerable. I did like some of the areas that were listed in the document and in the press conference yesterday as being protected: cyber, missile defense, space, precision strike. But we'll see more, how protected those capabilities are relative to the others as well. And then lastly, I think Vago mentioned innovation, and it was a word all over the document. I would have hoped to have seen more innovation in the QDR in the roughly year-long time frame that the Pentagon had to start to execute the QDR. There were there's a little bit more lip service to what's needed in terms of innovation. I would have liked to have seen examples of innovation, examples of more jointness, examples of leveraging 21st century business processes for greater efficiencies and effectiveness. So, I love the innovation label, but I would have liked to have seen more of it in the actual results of the strategic review.
Thanks, Barry. General Cartwright.
Thanks. The document can be read, by somebody, and they can fall in love with it or they can hate it. It's got plenty of room for both and interpretation. And so I chose to look at a couple of key issues in there that I thought were going to be important in understanding what risks were going to be assumed, what potential capabilities could be brought in to mitigate those risks, and what are the baseline activities. And there's a buzz phrase that goes through the whole document that says capability over capacity, okay? Which could be akin to a sizing construct. It could be any number of things. I think in the good in this, it is an acknowledgement that there has to be a reduction in force, that we're coming out of a conflict, and that we're going to have to start to think our way through a reduction in force. Now, the question is, are we really coming out of conflict, and reduced to do what? And how much of that is our choice and how much of it is the adversaries are all questions that you have to take a look at. But at the end of the day, there is, in fact, an intent stated clearly to reduce the size of the force to pre-war footing, okay? And so I give that, all right, we need to do that. The second is, in the strategy, are we looking at those things that are most dangerous or most likely? And it's always a conundrum. The priority has always been to go for most dangerous. This document in the vocabulary kind of turns it around and says we've got to fight the wars and live in the world we're actually in, and lead you to believe they're on a path towards most likely. But the reality is it's one of the first QDRs that has actually taken on the mix. The mix is the apportionment of forces between general purpose forces, special operations forces, and strategic forces. And the document is very clear that general purpose forces are going to be reduced, special operations forces are going to be increased, and that we're going to stay with the triad and modernize it. Now, whether we can afford to do all of that wasn't really addressed here, but it's the first QDR that I'm aware of, and certainly that I've participated in, where the mix was actually addressed and was specifically said, we're going to change that mix. And that's important in my mind. It's important because it starts to address the issue of where are we going with the strategic forces, which all need to be modernized. Those decisions are 50-year decisions, and they're very expensive. And as soon as this came out, you heard the Navy say, but of course somebody's going to give us money to do that, because that shouldn't come out of my coffers for general purpose forces. And it'll be interesting to see how that discussion goes on. The bomber's an issue there, the next generation ICBMs, et cetera, but it was very clear we will maintain a triad, and those forces are going to be modernized. So that's a shift. That's something I hadn't seen in the past. I think the third one, you always look for what is the general sizing construct, and the canonical 2 MTW, 2 MRC, et cetera, but the idea of trying to prevent or at least deter some sort of a blackmail scenario that makes you choose between two fights and not address one. It's interesting, the wording. I'm not sure why the wording was picked, but win decisively. So clearly, the first thing is defend the homeland. I find that interesting. That started to creep in the last 2 QDRs, but defend the homeland first. The second is win a decisive fight while simultaneously carrying on counterterrorism operations. So you now are going to do 3 things simultaneously. We're going to carry on counterterrorism, we're going to win decisively in some region, and we're going to defend the homeland simultaneously. In the past, we couldn't do 2 simultaneous. Now we're going to do 3. So, there's a question that's begged there about can you really do that? Where do the enablers come from that allow you to do 3 things simultaneously? How are they going to be built up? What's that going to look like? What are the force apportionments, et cetera? So the second is to impose significant pain and cost on an adversary in another region. I read that as this discussion about naval and air forces being used to prosecute at least a hold type campaign in a second region. Okay? Not unlike what we have today. The only thing is that you've got 3 simultaneous activities going on already, and now you're going to have a 4th. And so there's a little bit of mission creep here. It sounds a little bit like a bottom-up review in that everybody's got their paragraph in there, and so at the end of the day, are you really able to do all of those things? All of the problems that we had in the past about, well, let's make it near simultaneous. Well, let's separate it by 30 days. Well, maybe 45 days. Addressing the speed of shipping, addressing the ability to move ISR forward. All of those questions, now all of a sudden, we're going to do 3 things simultaneously, and it's not really identified how we would do that. So those 3 things. What is not addressed here that I would always be looking for, that the chairman took on to some extent, and his assessment is, how are you going to match the resources and the means to all of this activity? As I look at this, normally the way you do that is through the availability construct. So you have a size of the force, and then you have how fast does the force have to be able to close to do any of these things? What are you going to have resident? There's generally 4 types of activity going on. There's your strategic forces that have global reach. There are your PCS forces overseas, rotational forces overseas, and PREPO. Okay? For the most part, not many countries are asking us to come build bases in their country. So that's going to come down. That's going to change the ability to close force to a problem. How are we going to handle that? Is it more PREPO? Is it more strategic? There's really no addressal. And the cost for your availability construct is the bulk of your readiness cost. That's where your OMAN money is mostly spent. And so the question here is, what is that availability construct? What's it going to look like? It can't be what it was. And so you can see a lot of the strategy starting to build of lily pads and things like that in the Southern Pacific, et cetera. But what is that construct and what's it going to look like? And are you going to have all of your forces standing on their tippy toes all of the time? Or is there a tiering of the readiness in order to make it affordable and allow you to be forward? None of that's discussed here, and it leaves you questioning how are you going to afford all of this mission space as you move forward. I think the last part, and I just want to jump in on the innovation bandwagon here. It's a great buzzword to throw out there. We had a list in there of about a dozen things that they want to do, things like cyber, et cetera. But generally, at least from my experience, what you're trying to understand about the force is what are the major challenges against your ability to, in fact, accomplish the strategy you've laid out. And for me right now, I can see 2 or 3 here that are constant themes. There is really an issue that is developing in scale. Okay, we've moved to exquisite. I think it's the admiral that once said, and the end of exquisite is I have one ship on each coast. Okay, and it can't be sunk, but it can't be in the right place at the right time either. And so the question here is, how are you going to start to address the global scale that is called for in the document, the global response times that are called for in the document, in a way that allows you to move forward? What is it you're going to do fundamentally different than what you do today? An example, we talked about stealth, we talked about precision. Stealth and precision, when you look at them and their second and third order effects, are really about the ability to allow a force to be more efficient forward and therefore smaller. We've fought the world wars with armies. We fought Korea and Vietnam in divisions as the coin of the realm. This fight was brigades. The amount of mobility, the amount of survivability, the amount of opportunity and lethality to place a weapon against a target and expect it to work have fundamentally shifted. What are we going to do now to allow this force to be available on a global scale as we ask for it and we go forward? And there are a lot of technologies out there that would allow us to start doing that, but I don't see them called out in here. For instance, if you say cyber, all of a sudden, okay, what am I supposed to take from that? Is it cyber defense that you're talking about? What kind of cyber are you talking about? Why would you pick cyber? To me, things like cyber, things like directed energy, give you the ability to do something that we cannot do today. That is, potentially have a magazine that is almost unlimited. Okay, if you go put a ship, out in a place, it's limited by how many rounds it carries, an airplane, etc. If you change that dynamic, you fundamentally shift the equation. That's a potential that's here. The Navy's obviously doing experiments, as are the rest of the services with directed energy and with cyber. What are we trying to accomplish there? Is it the ability to do graduated effect, which each of those can do, that other weapons can't do? Is it the ability to move at the speed of light and therefore create closure capabilities and more decision time? Is it the idea that you want to be able to have an unlimited magazine? Each of those are possibilities in this next generation of weapons. Is the department looking at it from that perspective, or what perspective are they looking at it from? Will we build standalone platforms for new technologies? One of the most wasteful things that will generate hate and discontent, but that we're doing is we build ISR platforms and we build weapons platforms, and never the two shall meet, except in remotely piloted aircraft. Okay, why do we do that? Why do we do that to ourselves? We have no good reason for it, and we appear to be continuing down that path with several of the investment decisions. Why are they separated? Okay, what is the advantage of a remotely piloted something? Okay, aircraft, take as an example. Is it that it doesn't have a pilot in it? No, that's not an advantage. It doesn't cost you much more to put a pilot in an airplane than it does to not have them there. But if I take the pilot out, then I don't need to use 60% of the life of a platform for training. Okay, that's first. Second, if I take the pilot out, I don't build a JSF that doesn't go as far as the last generation airplane, doesn't carry as many weapons as the last generation airplane, yada, yada, yada. Okay, I'm not limited by that human being in the cockpit who can't fly for more than 9 hours, who can't take more than 6 or 7 Gs, etc. All of those things are significantly limiting, and we're paying a huge premium for very incremental improvements in our capabilities. We just did an effort between a couple of universities where we asked, okay, what would be the most leveraging things if you could come up with leveraging things for the Department of Defense to invest in? In the top 10, there was not a single platform, not one platform. There were all sorts of cognitive capabilities, networked capabilities that had far more leverage than a platform does today. And so the department's going to, in its acquisition reforms, have to start to think, in my mind, about an alternative approach to problems that says, don't build platform solutions. They don't get there in time. They're always built for the wrong issue by the time they're fielded. If you've got a 15-year lag between idea and fielding, it can't be relevant when it gets fielded. So then you have to wait 5 more years to upgrade it. And so where's the leverage, and how is acquisition going to start to address where actual leverage is versus where their incentive structure is today, which is an industrial construct? These have got to be addressed. I'm happy to talk about that more when we get into it, and I'll leave it at that.
I looked mainly at the threat environment piece in the QDR, and I have about 4 major points in looking at that piece. I think first, it downplays the threat. I mean, if you look at the first sentence there, it says the security environment remains uncertain and complicated. I mean, I would put dangerous in there. And part of it is that as it goes on in the second sentence, you have this broad array of threats. And how do you track all these different kinds of threats, given that, as they admit during the analysis, that you have both non-state and state actors now that are both enabled by technology, in which non-state actors have some of the attributes that we formally ascribe to states of being able to perpetrate great harm in terms of violence and disruption. There's lip service given to that, but certainly when you total it all up, I don't get the sense here that they want to play this up in any sense to the true magnitude of it, and that given that a lot of the other part of the document is dealing with how to cut back, it's maybe here there's some incentive for downplaying some of the threat environment. The second point is on the non-state actors, and I think this gets to some of what Barry talked about. There really is nothing about biotech and the threat posed. I mean, you can't find the word here. They talk about technology enabling non-state actors, but really there's nothing there that, we have done a lot of work in the Atlantic Council looking at that, and that is in the medium term, the long term. I mean, one of the biggest threats. The third point I would put out there is that given the threat environment, why don't we see more about efforts really to understand that and efforts to do foresight on it? I mean, that would seem to me to be one of your big enabling capabilities, if you want to deal with this very varied threat environment, that you would begin to think about what General Cartwright was saying, the dangerous and the likely. I mean, I think you have to begin to look at all the different types of threats and begin to think about, obviously ones are not as likely as others, but there are factors that could lead them to being very likely. And how do you gauge these sort of threats, and how do you embed that into your strategy, and changing your strategy as the threat environment in different areas begins to change. The fourth point would be that I know this is a departmental review, but there really is very little on whole of government. And when you look at these threats, I mean, they do admit it at points when you're talking about Iran. They talk about the State Department's efforts with the P5+1. There's some on climate change, talk about other parts of the government that can play a role. But again, when you're thinking about developing a strategy, how you link up with other parts of the government, given they are multifaceted threats, they're not going to be just dealt with through military means. It seems to me that you really have to be thinking, and you have to embed that again in your strategy of how you work with other departments within the government to really tackle these threats. And the fact that there's basically nothing really about that, how they see themselves and how they work with other departments, I mean, is an indication that, again, I don't think anybody is really thinking that out anywhere in government, but it should be part of your departmental strategy. And with that, I'll end.
Steve.
Okay, very good. I will actually focus a large part of what I have to say on the complement to the QDR, which is to say the budget. At least that's one of the things one might call a complement to the QDR. Having said that, I'm going to make one observation about the QDR. I would judge any strategy document, be it in business or in government, any strategy document by the following measure, following rubric, as a high school teacher I think would call these things. Is there clarity about the ends, the ways, and the means? And is there coherence among those three things? Right? The ends being what you're trying to achieve, or ideally an expression of outcomes. The means, the resources you're going to use to achieve those outcomes, and the ways being an articulation of how you're going to employ those resources, organize them or otherwise, to achieve those ends. By that measure, I think the QDR gets a 2 out of 3. I think it's clear enough about the ends. It's very explicit about the means, maybe painfully so in some respect. And it is quite bereft of a clear articulation of the ways that would allow us to judge whether there's really sufficient coherence between and among those three things to make for a really good strategy. I'll leave what's been said about I'll have nothing else for the moment to say about the Quadrennial Defense Review, although I will come back to the theme of ways in my critique, if you will, of the budget. So there are a couple things about the budget which strike me as pretty important, even though it was delivered in a way that I think was designed to appear as anodyne. We're supposed to be not that interested in this budget, and I think actually this budget is profound in a couple different ways that I want to point out. The first is, I believe we can mark this budget, and really beginning with the Ryan Murray budget agreement in December, as the bottom of the cycle, which is a really big deal for a couple of reasons. And when I say that, what I mean is, I think the base budget, in one's expectations of how the cycle of defense spending is going to run, the base budget, I think is bottomed out at $496. We now have 3 successive years of the base budget being appropriated in the previous 2 years at 496 and now being requested at 496. And that's a big deal for at least two reasons, one of which is there are lots of responsible voices in this town who as little as 6 months ago did not think the bottom was above 450, which is a whole different QDR and a whole, not completely, but a substantially, we'd be having a very substantially different conversation. So a base budget that is anchored now, has a floor at about $500 billion is a big deal. That there is, I think, nearly a consensus about that. Right? I don't hear any responsible voices with any authority in town saying too much defense spending at $500 billion base. Inside the Pentagon, this is a big deal because it changes what are otherwise bad incentives between and among the military departments and OSD for how to plan about the future. When the military services don't know what the floor is, they are not properly incentivized, I'll put this politely for the moment, to make trade-offs that are necessary to get there, right? If you underestimate the floor or if you overestimate the floor, you can make mistakes, and they're very loath to do that until they know what the floor is. So if others, if the community generally comes to adopt a conviction or a confidence in this being the floor, I think it will improve their ability to actually begin making trade-offs, coming to agreement about the ways that they're going to make this strategy and the resources that are available in it cohere. I also think this is hardly an anodyne budget for three things about it I want to point out. One is, I have to credit my friend of many in this room, Byron Callan from Capital Alpha Partners, for a quick analysis he's done comparing, with respect to procurement, comparing the amount of money that was basically in the defense program in the fiscal year 15 column last year, just 12 months ago, when the fiscal year 14 budget was requested. How much money was in the procurement accounts 12 months ago as compared to how much money is in this budget request? So, and the reason this is relevant is because in one respect, you look at the budget and you say, well, it's kind of level from year to year. Not bad. You guys ought to be able to do okay. But what that is disguising is the fact that there was a lot more money planned as little as 12 months ago in procurement than there is today, to the tune of, in aircraft, 7%, but in missiles, 26%, in ground systems, let's say 26%, ammunition 36%, other 32%. So, right, there's a whole lot of program in the acquisition system which to get to this budget has to be taken out, even though the top line stayed level. Second, I think, worth taking notice of is the amount of, the magnitude and direction of change in efficiencies that have to be basically carved out of the program in order to make this fiscal guidance. And remember, make this fiscal guidance is not the is not the sequestration profile, right? It's the sequestration profile in fiscal year 15, but it's the president's hope to add about $20 to $30 billion a year above the sequestration profile beginning in 2016. Even to get to that higher level, there's $94 billion over 5 years of efficiencies that have to be taken out, again, of that program that they carried forward from last year. These numbers are completely abstract in one respect. If who has to deal with $94 billion? But to try to put them in perspective, I think Bob Hale, the outgoing comptroller, has done, you reporters and other things, has done a number of favors for you without exactly poking a stick in the eye of anybody he works for. He recites, whenever he talks about the efficiencies, he recites the trend line of efficiencies over the last 3 budgets. He points out that in fiscal year 12, Secretary Gates famously, to my ears anyway, had imposed a $150 billion efficiency initiative. In FY13, about half that scale, $60 billion. In FY14, $35 billion, right? So there's all the low-hanging fruit is gone. That's a lot of money. In FY15, it's 94, kind of going in the wrong direction. We're going to have to go back to a grove that already is missing all of its low-hanging fruit and find, 3 times again as much efficiencies as we found last year. There's a little bit more in the comptroller's most interesting document, once you get through the QDR, is this document from the comptroller. It's almost his own QDR, actually. And there you can find an articulation that you don't find in the QDR of a little bit more of these ways. Where are they going to get this money? How are they going to get this money? And when you do that, you will discover the other kind of storyline that I've not heard read, nobody's plainly talking about, and that is we have a readiness crisis in this military force, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. I want to read you the topic headlines from this comptroller's report. So, Chapter 2, seek a balanced force. I'm going to skip Chapter 3, which is on readiness. Chapter 4, continue to focus on institutional reform, pursue compensation changes, pursue investments, blah, blah, blah. Chapter 3 is called Prepare for Prolonged Readiness Challenges. Well, I'm sorry, I have that comical look on my face because if in fact the way we're going to make coherence out of the ends, ways, and means in this QDR and budget is to trade off readiness for other things, which is they're not being explicit about it, but that's how I read this. That is a brand new strategy. That is what I would call a brand new strategy. That's not a strategy that, at least consciously, we have ever adopted before. I think we unwittingly, perhaps in the late 70s, arguably a bit in the early to mid 90s, may have of necessity and unwittingly done that. But this is starting to sound like an actual strategy. Is we're going to trade off some near-term readiness until we can get the force structure down at the end of the decade to the point that we could actually afford to maintain the forces at a higher state of readiness. I'm interpolating. They're not saying that, but I think there's a storyline there that's worth pulling out, and that is actually how I read the numbers and can make sense of this.
Thanks very much, Steve. Although I would point out on the $94 billion number, fundamental force structure changes like cutting A-10s don't count toward efficiencies.
Correct.
And that's one of the things that they're doing in that $94 billion, which is somewhat disingenuous, right? That's just a cut. That's not an efficiency thing. You're not figuring out any newer way of doing stuff. It is what it is, as you would say.
No, right, but I mean, that makes the $94 billion a taller stack, not a shorter one.
Yeah, an odder one, right? The other ones were just like, I'm trying to become more efficient and do some things. And I can also look at the mix and say they're taking, for example, 6% out of military personnel, but 5% out of civilians, and civilians grew faster than military personnel did even. But I want us to talk about a number of different issues and also open up questions to the floor. And I apologize for the Twitterati out there not saying that it's hashtag ACQDR. Alex wanted me to mention that, and so I have now mentioned that for anybody who feels compelled to be tweeting right now. The one question quickly, which I'd like to get your take on, is the criticism directed toward the administration that it does not have a strategy, and it is fundamentally not writing, that it should develop a strategy, then figure out how to resource it. And I want to get your guys' take on, A, does the administration have a strategy or not? Is it something that people disagree with, or is it bereft of strategy? And the second question is, how do you make strategy, and is it unresource constrained? Barry?
Well, this is
and then
the question
quickly on down the line, and then I'd like to ask you about Ukraine, and then open it up to the floor.
This is the question I think that most QDRs grapple with, and at the risk of embarrassing General Cartwright, I always quote General Cartwright when this question is asked, which is those who suggest that you can do strategy without a sense of your available resources. The exact quote is, a strategy without a sense of resources is a hallucination. If I assumed unlimited resources, I would develop missions to defend Mars against Jupiter. I mean, there's no, there's no constraint whatsoever on your ambitions if you assume unlimited resources. The art of strategy, as Steve said, is harnessing your means, your resources, in innovative ways to accomplish your ends. And so you have to have an iterative process. It doesn't work the way it's taught in the Army War College, which is you set your strategy, you then set your forces, and then you set your budget. That never happens. The American people have an appetite, as represented in the Congress, for providing resources for the defense of the nation. We can't assume that that's an unlimited appetite. There are other needs on our valuable federal budget dollars, and so I think it's an iterative process, and I think you need to work with the White House and all of the different DoD components to come up with the appropriate mix, the appropriate sort of interlocking system of strategy, forces and capabilities, and resources.
General Cartwright.
Yeah, I won't play through that again. I thought one thing that I found interesting was that the baseline document is the 2012 document, which is in revision right now at the White House. And so, you're releasing this against the 2012 document while you're in revision of the newest strategy guidance. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect. Now, the belief is that there was a good dialogue going on intergovernment and that was accommodated, but it is a little unusual that we kind of did it that way.
Matt?
I think you need a strategy before you have a QDR for the reason that, these problems are multifaceted. And part of it is, when you're looking at them, is that you're thinking just not of the military solution, but also the part that other departments and
The whole of government
are going to play in
been
it.
talking
And that's, why you should be thinking about, having the strategy first. And then people can figure out how they fit into that, and also what are the synergies between different programs. I mean, because that's, I think, part of if you're looking at innovation, that would be one of the ways that you would try to innovate.
I want to ask Steve slightly different question of you. And Frank Kendall, the Pentagon Acquisition Chief, as well as Dempsey himself in his chairman's assessment, writes about how, Americans expect that the United States forces will always have that technological edge, and that technological edge is actually perishable and may be shrinking. Did you see enough in the document, as a former industrial policy chief of the Pentagon, that addresses some of the industrial base concerns that have been reflected by some of the Pentagon leadership, Dr. Carter being one of them, who used to talk about the importance of the industrial base as providing or being the arsenal of democracy, as it will?
I think there was enough, which is to say I don't think the document is a place to articulate any sort of grand industrial strategy. So, but for my appetite, certainly it was enough. There is one particular initiative in this budget that is manifestly an industrial policy initiative, and that is to start an advanced turbine engine project, explicitly to keep the engineering industrial base of the country going in a period of time when we aren't necessarily otherwise developing any brand new engines. So I think it's enough. The only other thing I would add to that is that necessarily the technological per se advantage that the United States has over the rest of the world, adversaries in particular, is going to narrow. We can't, it's a natural effect of the profusion of technology and the growth of middle-class economies and other things that Matt has taught me. And therefore, what we need to do now to innovate, our next turn of innovation, maybe not the only one, has got to be on more innovative ways of operating, of employing technologies. If we can get much faster, same an analog that we employed when we were trying to achieve technological innovation, if we can get much faster than the adversary at figuring out how to employ both new technologies and frankly employ our existing technologies, using that concept really broadly, in different, faster ways, more adaptable ways, et cetera, then we can stay ahead of competition even when technologically the world is getting closer to us. I'm going to grab the first question just because I've been dying to say this.
Go ahead, Steve.
Which is this.
Run with
Whenever I hear that criticism of the QDR, not strategic, I think of who once was my 4-year-old nephew. Children at that age, I would argue to you, most children, are classically unstrategic. His favorite comment, my then 4-year-old nephew, and I have 3, so each of them can deny this, was, "I want what I want." And you'd say, well, right, but then you won't be able, so, and he'd say, I want what I want. That's what I think of when I hear this criticism of the QDR, that it's, too much on resources, not enough on strategy. I want what I want.
So you're saying, as a former Army officer, that whole Carlisle barracks training of "I want what I want" has percolated?
Infantile is the word I would associate with it.
Wow.
Literally, not just to be sarcastic, I mean literally infantile.
Sir?
Yeah, the only thing I push back on a little bit is that it's not that we don't want to build better platforms, but the diminishing returns in doing that is there's not enough leverage there. You've got to get to the cognitive side of this activity. That's where the leverage is. It's in the IT and the networks and the cognitive side of doing business. And if we're going to try to compete by building the next best platform, quite frankly, we'll price ourselves out of the market, number one. Number two, the idea that innovative ways of employing, innovative ways in the art of war are always really important. I mean, I won't underplay that, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to come up with things that are highly leveraging to remain competitive here, and that's not likely to be in the things side of the equation.
Let me ask now about Ukraine very carefully, very quickly. If you look at it, Russia is good at playing its cards and tends to like to do things that other people can't stop it from doing. We need Russia in Iran. We need Russia in Syria. We need the Russians to not send advanced air defense missiles to Iran, for example, among other things. They're important in Syria. They're important in North Korea and the dialogue there with Pyongyang. What are some of the things the United States in this current crisis can and should do, or are there going to be things that are going to be ultimately futile and then play into the narrative of the administration being impotent somehow, and that playing out on a global stage? Barry?
Sure. Well, as I said in my remarks, I think, if Russia goes further towards using military means to secure all or part of eastern Ukraine beyond the Crimea, I think we're in a different environment, because the chances then of a civil war are higher. The chances of insecurity on NATO's eastern front are much higher. We'll have to look again at Europe as a dangerous theater that would draw forces, as opposed to a theater that can provide support for forces to go elsewhere. So that's number one. In terms of the overall approach to Russia and to this crisis, I think there's a number of measures that we should be taking, and there's a bit of a balance that we have to strike. So I think the key, as I would say, the 3 pieces that I think of are: 1, dissuade Putin from further advances into Ukraine, and wherever possible, seek to roll back the military occupation, if you will, of Crimea broadly. That involves a number of potential measures. Number 2, I think we need to reassure our nervous Eastern NATO allies. I mean, they joined NATO because they were scared of Russia, of the Russian threat. And so some sort of measured, appropriate deployments into Poland, Romania, I think those could go a long way towards reassuring those allies, which is a legal and, in my view, moral obligation of the United States as a treaty signatory of the NATO treaty. Those 2 objectives are somewhat in tension. I don't think we want to go so far and be so aggressive in our dissuasive efforts that we actually provoke a deeper crisis or foment a deeper crisis, and indeed potentially instigate a mini Cold War. But I do think we need a combination of those measures to achieve the goals. And then I think third, we need to play a long game, and that means using the U.S.'s new energy surplus to start helping Europe diversify its energy supplies. There are things that can be done. The president can use this as an opportunity to do what many are calling for anyway, which is to strengthen the infrastructure for energy exports, in particular of LNG, both in exporting facilities as well as other facilities overseas. We can also reaffirm that NATO's door is open to sovereign states that meet NATO's criteria. And I'm not saying we should enlarge NATO now. I'm saying we need to sort of renew that commitment to an alliance that ultimately is our primary vehicle for I think, as was said in the first Bush administration, securing a Europe that is whole and free. I think that's still a very legitimate objective. And I think this administration's been a little, hasn't taken the necessary measures in that third category, in that last category, as it probably should have. That's my overall approach to how to deal with this.
Sir?
There are a substantial number of levers that are available. The question is how to employ them, what effect they will have once employed. Do they move you in a direction that's good, number one. Number two, do not look at this crisis as something that will be solved in a week or two. Think more in terms of years, to work through this. I think one of the interesting things here is, if you look at the QDRs, okay, now does the 450, 420 number make sense? The Army's certainly finally found something to rally around there. NATO has too.
Don't let any good crisis go to a waste
Exactly.
when you're making a force structure decision.
But the question here is, there is a toolbox there. Will it be effective? Will we be able to do it? And that toolbox shouldn't start with the military, but the military can play a role, and I think Barry's outlined that role pretty nicely. But we don't want to take the wrong lessons away from this, nor do we want to underplay this will be done in a week or two mindset. That's just not going to be the case. Even if we solve the problem in the short term of the Russian forces and their role, this is still an internal civil war that's going to be hugely disruptive in the region.
Sir?
I mean, I would agree with both General Cartwright's and Barry's comments, and emphasize too, it has to be a balanced approach. I mean, the worry I would have now is that you don't want to split the West between, Central European, or some Central Europeans wanting a much more aggressive, and others, Germany and others not. I mean, it's very important actually for the U.S. to maintain that Western solidarity.
All of the Cold War.
Yeah, well, in a Cold War, when you're thinking of discouraging Russia from taking any more aggressive steps, I think it's important that you do have a solid West. But the other point is playing this as a long game, and maybe this gets back to the discussion at the of the QDR. I mean, there's very little on energy in the QDR, and yet. You could look at that particularly, the thing that has changed in the last 3 to 5 years is the fact that the U.S. does have that as a real leverage point. And, this is a real way of countering Russia's hold over its neighbors. And that's something, that, again, that has to be played out with the allies. But it's something that needs to be put up there as part of the strategy and really embedded in the larger strategy.
Steve?
2 thoughts on this. One is I regret, for what that's worth, how this crisis is being framed as a test of the of President Obama, when it feels so much more to me like a test of Chancellor Merkel. She has a lot more at stake in this, and she has a lot more consequently leverage, frankly, real practical leverage over Mr. Putin. And so I'll just, that keeps striking me, is how somehow why and how this is being framed as a test of America. Instead, I would argue this is sort of another nice reminder that it's a post-American world, and we shouldn't necessarily regret that. Point one. The other point I want to come back to is readiness. Now, I'm going to throw a couple of thoughts out there, one of which I know to be true, the other of which someone can correct me on. Okay? Fair warning. So there have been some, I think, wanton and bad suggestions that we put some ground forces in Poland as a show of strength. Setting aside what one might think strategically about how that would affect the course of events, I don't think there are 2 brigades of the U.S. Army that are in a position of readiness to deploy to Poland right now. I don't think there are 2. Moreover, I don't think we have I don't think we sail an amphibious force in the Mediterranean anymore, for example. So I don't recommend that we muster forces out to that region personally, but if something else happened and we wanted to, we're back to this issue about readiness. I don't think we have very many actual ground forces that could get there very quickly and be very ready to fight.
Army leaders have said that, although the Army readiness model, as you know, is a binary one. You're either in or you're out, and that's a great argument to make to support more forces, which is, look, I'm not meeting my readiness standards, and I could argue all the readiness standards of all the services are absurd, really. I mean, in the Air Force, you could fail an operational readiness inspection because the guy didn't square his corner coming over to the guy to tell you that his unit's ready. I mean, that's kind of like a ridiculous thing to flunk on. True story, Chuck Horner told me that, and it was kind of a, and it was much funnier. Obviously, anybody who knows General Horner involved a lot of laughing, as well as a moral to the tale. But a question, though, is, a number of our allies have been, for their own reasons, pressing the case that we are weak, we're somehow abandoning them. The Defense Strategic Guidance was looked at as, well, you're abandoning us in Europe. In Asia, that was welcomed, although the Japanese, for reasons of their own, are started, well, America might not be there, so I have to build up my own military strength, which, combined with other statements out of the Abe government, have been driving everybody crazy, including us here in Washington. And then Gulf states, for their own reasons, have been saying, well, we can't trust you guys here in America. You by strategy said that you're not focused as much on us. That this document, this QDR, which includes so much, repeating over and over again, Europe is foundational to our security, saying over and over again that our interests in the Middle East and in the Persian Gulf region transcend, that it's not temporary, that it's lasting and permanent. Did this document do enough to reassure some of those allies that have questioned us about whether you'll be around? Poles, for example, have sort of said, well, I wanted to see a little bit more on Europe. Certainly Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and UAE, where you've spent some time, Barry. Does this document do anything to assuage any of those concerns?
I mean, I think the document does, a reasonable job of what any document can do, mentioning them, the importance, et cetera. But I think we're at a point, at least in this administration, where they're not looking for rhetoric so much as, more activity in the diplomatic area, in the military area, in other areas. And so, I mean, I think they're at the Munich Security Conference, which is the annual major European security discussion among officials, the U.S. deployed its officials, its senior cabinet officials, Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel, and they once again, for the nth year in a row, said, Europe is really important to us. And I just have to say, because of the activity or the lack of activity over the last few years, the Europeans whom I spoke to, the European officials, were saying, we're just not believing it anymore. It's time. It's too much. It's a lot of words, and it's not as much activity or action or measures or initiatives or high-level engagement by the president and by his other senior officials. So I think I'm not sure what any document could have done at this point. I think they need more real-world deeds. That's my own view.
But in the case of the Gulf states, one of the things they want is for us to become more actively involved in Syria, and are judging our our commitment to them based on our lack of commitment to getting involved in Syria. And I'm wondering, how on earth do you address that fundamental frustration without getting involved in something you don't want to get involved in?
That's a whole other panel. But they see Syria as an absence of commitment even at the humanitarian level. So, I mean, we could talk for hours on this, but, I mean, in a nutshell, the U.S. responds to earthquakes in Asia and typhoons in Asia, but it doesn't respond when 140,000 civilians, mostly Sunnis, are being killed wantonly by a dictator when we have some means to ameliorate that, if not to preclude it. That's what's creating disaffection.
A Shia dictator.
That's what's creating disaffection in the population in these countries. This isn't just officials, but the average, person in their society sees this on TV and they're wondering, I don't understand this. I really don't understand why the United States isn't using even its limited means to address this. Why are we being singled out as not worthy of saving? That's what I'm hearing.
Right.
I mean, there are plenty of countries around the world that will fight to the last American, commit us to things that, they feel we ought to be doing. I think, and I, technically call it an availability construct, but it is the ability to close to a problem, okay? What is the construct we're going to do that by, and then do we demonstrate it so that countries know there is either skin in the game to do this, that we have it. And that's whether you're talking Syria or whether you're talking, the current conflicts, associated with Russia and Crimea. What the countries want to know is, are you going to be there? What kind of skin in the game do you demonstrate? And what kind of capability and capacity do you have to meet that? And so it goes back to the ends, ways, means, and right now the ways is a question mark in most of our allies' minds. I mean, 4 LCS and 2,000 Marines don't make the Southern Pacific feel all that safe.
Do you guys have something to add on?
The commander of the 1st MEF, Lejeune, Colonel Scott Benedict was up here 3 weeks ago for an event that I moderated, and he made an observation that I hadn't previously appreciated. And he talked about how in the early part of his career, he's a colonel, so he's been around for 25 years or 20 years or so. He would see foreign forces all the time. Engage with them, exercise with them, share, officers on training. He says in the last 10 years when we've been at war, he says there's an entire cadre of lieutenants, captains, and majors who really haven't done that. And I thought it was a testament in my mind to how the wars, that we've been engaged in have really come at a cost of what I think, at least in the naval services, they, call presence. And I think that presence, as the term befits, is a lot of what I think partners, aside from the rhetoric, the pivot to Asia rhetoric, I think that actual palpable presence is a lot of what these partners are calling for. And unfortunately, again, I don't know that in this Quadrennial Defense Review and this force plan and the readiness levels that we're actually going to quickly change that, even when we return from Afghanistan.
Matt, anything to add?
No, I don't.
I'm going to start with Paul first, and then you can go to Harlan, and then you, sir.
General Cartwright, assuming you've been invited to have dinner with the President of the United States at Camp David, not on anyone's schedule, and he says to you,
Can you get those?
off the record, tell me, won't go anywhere else, what you consider to be the main threat facing our nation today, and are we prepared, are we ill-prepared, or are we well-prepared to face it?
Violent extremism and the nexus with WMD. And I think we could have been more explicit in saying that the SOF are absolutely responsible for that fight and for being able to convince the world that no matter who you are, we will find you. Kind of more like declaratory policy. So that would be where I would focus in on. Not the most dangerous, but certainly the nexus between danger and likely.
There's a microphone here that we should.
So Barry, your framework early on, which ended with resources matching forces, I think was exactly right. The reason we're talking about all these cutbacks and reductions is essentially because we've had a budget framework for the past 3 years, the Budget Control Act, which has essentially put the department and the federal budget, discretionary budget, in a box. This QDR says explicitly we can do 15 at significantly higher risk. The chairman and the secretary in the budget, or in the document, essentially say, but by the way, if we're still in this box in 16, we're going to have to relook everything. And there have been a couple of senior officials who have maybe had career-limiting statements to say, we can't do the strategy. Given the events of Ukraine, for example, do we have any indications that we think that we're actually going to get out of this this budget box? Because if not, then this QDR is essentially an IQDR. It's an interim QDR, because the department is on record saying if we have the 16 budget as we project now, all bets are off.
I like the way you framed it.
I will put actually a couple numbers to that, which is to say the difference between the 16 budget that's being planned and the sequestration level is $51 billion. I'm looking at Bob Hale's helpful chart here. The reason that we're not at the crisis, at the strategic crisis that you're alluding to, is because we're not planning for a $500 billion 16. We're planning for a $535 billion 16. And so where that discrepancy between what we had been, what I call the momentum of the program, was $51 billion. If you plan for the president's profile, that discrepancy is $16 billion. And yeah, you still got to get $94 billion over 5 years of efficiencies and things like that, but it fits. But the only other thing I would say is I find a sort of a weird kabuki debate going on over sequestration, which is to say I don't know anybody, and certainly nobody with a majority of votes in Congress, who likes a defense budget in FY16 of $500 billion. I think there is nearly a consensus, certainly a majority, for a defense budget that is bigger than that, something like 535. So my expectation is that, particularly with the federal annual deficit coming down as rapidly as it has, we'll figure this. They will figure this out in 16.
Barry,
Paul doesn't agree with me.
You're shaking your head.
No, I just don't think I don't think there is the will in the Congress to increase the defense budget for a bit. Number one, and I don't think you have a president pressing them hard to do so. Without either of those two factors, I'm not necessarily sure this is even a floor. That's my view. I did want to highlight that the chairman's assessment of this document is really interesting. It's more interesting than I've seen in previous. I would strongly encourage everybody to read the last chapter of this in addition to the first chapter. Let me just read you one or two sentences from this, which gets to Paul's question. There's a paragraph called "The Reality of Global Responsibilities" on page 63, which I think might be the most important paragraph in this entire document. And I won't read the whole paragraph, but it just says a lot of things are getting more difficult, a lot of our systems are getting more vulnerable, a lot of our adversaries are getting more diverse and capable. Not unheard of from a professional military institution, but nevertheless, a lot of detail in here, which I agree with. All of these factors diminish our present military advantage and complicate our ability to meet ambitious strategic objectives. And here's the line that really caught me. The chiefs and I are working with the Secretary of Defense to refine and prioritize U.S. military objectives to align with the size and capabilities of our program force. They don't know how these forces are going to execute this strategy. They're still working on it. So that, to me, is a really important statement. And I'm not sure where we go from here based on that.
The one thing which I will say is I think that if you look at the electoral landscape, and if the Republican, I spoke to a very well plugged in Republican friend of mine who feels he was very dejected in saying this to me, but he said, well, I think we win in November, we win the Senate. And I said, well, why are you so, downbeat about that? You ought to be overjoyed by that. And he's like, well, he said, the thing is, he said, the Tea Party guys have taken a vacation. They haven't gone away. And he said, they're going to be further empowered when, we do win in November, in which case he goes, it's going to make the last couple of years look like a cakewalk compared to what's going to come. And so he said, it's going to be a challenge. And he said, they're not really moved or concerned about defense spending as much as the traditional part of the caucus is, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that breaks. It could break toward defense, and that's certainly a hope that some people have. But if you get into a broader federal deficit, right, and these guys are propelled by the deficit, then you're going to see a reduction in government spending with a much broader mantle to actually achieve a reduction in government spending. In which case, 450 might look good.
But it has been, sorry, I'm going to jump in. It has been since the summer of 2010 that anyone has been able to put 219 votes together in the House on that proposition. The sequestration fever has been broken. Boehner is willing to pass fiscal measures with Democratic votes.
Sir, Harlan.
First, I usually don't get up this early, especially on a chilly morning, but it was well worth it. An observation and a question for General Cartwright. Before we get too carried away with technology, Vietnam and Afghanistan seem to demonstrate that that's not always the best virtue to have. But for you, Jim, it seems to me the two fatal flaws of the budget and the QDR are amnesia and cognitive dissonance. Amnesia in the sense that we seem to have forgotten Afghanistan and Iraq. The military was a surrogate, and that didn't work. And I don't see how the QDR has really raised that, except most implicitly. But more importantly, in terms of cognitive dissonance, we're not spending 500 this year on defense. We're spending closer to 600 when you figure the president's 26 and OCO, which would be probably close to 80. Now, I would argue that, unfortunately, the inbuilt costs for people, retirement, health care, weapon systems, we're not going to bring in the F-35 at less than $200 million apiece. $500 million for LCS is ludicrous. And unless we really grab all that, it seems to me that we're looking at a budget, and I disagree with you, Steve, with right now a ceiling, probably a floor around 400 to 450, which is traditional. But even if it goes down to 500, we're at 600, that's at least a 20% reduction. And it seems to me if you take a look at all the studies, by the end of the decade, without sequestration, if we don't do anything, we're going to see a 40% cut in personnel, or we're not going to buy any new systems. And so my question really to you is this. It seems to me that this budget has not gone far enough. In other words, we haven't really taken the steps that we need to prepare for a really rough landing. And so do you think this is what the limits of politics allow? Or is the department still playing an ostrich game with its head in the sand?
Yes and yes. I mean, there's some of both here. It's painful for me to think that $500 billion isn't enough money. It just depends on how you move forward. And the question is, will the department, I got technology and how people have the aversion of using technology as a solution, but the leverage out there that's available to this country, the intellectual capacity, all of those things, and bringing them to bear in a way that that would find $500 billion more than adequate, I think is still out there. We've played so many games of, I'm going to completely break if you get me close to this number or on this date. And you get there and you go, well, gosh, actually I got more money than I thought, and I'm going to bring all those civilians back in or whatever. And so my worry is that an all-volunteer force, an entitlement system, a military entitlement system that is necessary to support an all-volunteer force starts to put you on a footing of aging that force, which means that that's where the cost goes up. And the question that I'm trying to wrestle with is, are there technologies, are there procedures out there that would basically draw that age back down, interfaces with machines and people, et cetera, in a way that would allow us, one, to control our personnel costs and still believe, I mean, the coin of the realm in the military is a high school graduate, you know, and 3 years, useful years of a high school graduate. That's the norm. And when the average age of the force now starts to get towards 26, you're not really dealing with a high school graduate anymore, and now you're dealing with retirement and retention and issues like that rather than the other way around. We have to start to think about that, think about the construct of the force, and start to plan accordingly. And we're just not doing those kinds of things. We're continuing to go in a direction that is very much predictable from any one of the past conflicts or drawdowns. And I tend to agree with you, that makes the norm, which is in the 4 to 450 area, more likely, not less likely. And until behavior changes or the world intervenes, you know, I think you're probably right. We're heading towards that direction.
More questions? Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm hearing a lot about the QDR and the FY15 budget. Are those the same, or does the QDR impact the fit up, the FY16 POM, you know, PBR for next year? I guess it's a freshman question about PPBE. How does the QDR fit into that?
It's, you know, the QDR is, I think, in principle, the document that will guide for 4 years force planning and budgeting and programming. So I think the short answer to your question is they are complements of one another.
And PB15 is the multi-year spending plan that's bolted to that. Will be updated again next year, but.
So the FY15 is, the QDR is manifest in FY15, or let it take it until FY16?
No, it begins to be expressed in FY15, absolutely.
It's a 4-year spending bill.
Delivered with that budget. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I have a. You raised your hand.
I wanted to respond a little bit to Harlan.
Please.
In two respects. One is he has introduced a really important factor that I chose to ignore, and that is the OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operations money, which they haven't actually put a budget request forward yet, but it's been indicated again by the comptroller that, you know, they're planning on about an $80 billion appropriation request for 15, right? For 15, 3/4 of which in principle will be a period of time when our forces have all, you know, but some small amount hopefully been returned from Afghanistan. And the importance of that is that we have gotten comfortable with this artificial parsing of the defense budget between base and OCO, which truly is artificial. And it's very important and helpful to remind oneself of that periodically, because, for example, when you do remind yourself of that, you realize that, well, the bottom of the cycle is not going to be, as I had said, on a base budget only in FY15. The bottom of the budget, once you've added in OCO, is going to be probably in 16, 17, maybe 18. The second significance of the OCO is because it is outside the limitations of sequestration, it creates a relief valve on some of the hardest, particularly readiness problems, but even on occasion modernization problems that the budgeteers and program managers have. So I think that was, I'm glad you reminded us of that, because it allows me to amplify what was otherwise a little bit of a simplistic characterization I made before. Secondly, I think you and I could get about halfway toward one another on where the bottom is going to be if I were to acknowledge that the purchasing power for forces and military capability that you get from a $500 billion base budget, given the amount of entitlements, just put simply, that budget has to buy as compared to what it was buying 5, 10, 15 years ago, is certainly more like 450. I don't know if that, you know, but I would certainly agree with that. I think that's part of your point.
General Cartwright?
There was a statement in this that over the last 12 hours I've probably written more about than anything else, which was the statement that we are not going to plan for or size to long-term occupational forces, which, you know, the first response is you don't necessarily get a vote in that. But you can build an availability construct that would allow Guard, Reserve, Draft to, you know, to be played in that game. But the problem here is there's almost no addressal of what we're going to do with Guard and Reserve. And it is something that we really have to. I was concerned that people have said, well, the Guard and Reserve cost almost as much as the active when they're called up. Well, duh. You know, but when they're not called up, they are a fundamental increment closer to being ready to go to combat than the guy on the street. Okay, and the question here is, what do we want of our Guard and Reserve? And in these two conflicts, Iraq and Afghanistan, the Guard and Reserve really have represented that ethos of the citizen soldier. And they have kept the country connected to the military. And we ought to, I'm concerned that we're not putting enough thought to what we want of our Guard and Reserve and how they play a meaningful role.
Just a last sort of hard question issue. This challenge, I think, is a lot worse. Harlan, you've talked about it a little bit, and several of us up here have, which is the challenge is much harder this time around. People cost a lot more money. We have a lot less margin, so as we get ready to trade off forces, we don't have the trade-off margin that we had before. From an industrial-based perspective, further consolidation may not be a desirable thing, so we might not necessarily be able to go down that road. And also, we fundamentally have ended up, because of our own processes and regulations, made almost everything more expensive at the end of the day, not less expensive, or very expensive and not a lot of capability, which is the criticism on the LCS. So it seems the Army has how many billions of dollars spent on new armored vehicles that are never now going to materialize? How much Comanche?
There's about $30 billion that never led to a program.
You know, 30 billion with a B, right? I mean, the Pentagon is one of the few places where it goes, well, it was only $3 billion, you know, which would be an outrage in almost any other department. The question I have is there a recognition that look, I mean, even pay and benefits reform, right? Every one of these has a powerful political constituency. When Thomas Gates recommended an all-volunteer force, it was also promotion reform, pay and benefits. I mean, you know, everything had to be reformed as opposed to sort of sticking with a lot of the same processes that we have now. And other leaders, Vern Clark talked about on-ramps and off-ramps. Admiral Mullen has talked about it. You heard General Cartwright now also about, you know, connection with the population as you further shrink, more backgrounds, more super bases. So it would seem on virtually every important thing we're sort of getting it wrong, right? And so is there a recognition that we're getting it wrong? I think there is, but, and what is it that we're ready to do about it to fundamentally fix it? Because jingoistic solutions on why you hate the troops, right, which is what the military unions come up with, is not necessarily the answer either. I mean, are we close to solving this, or are we just going to be in the barrel and sort of go over the falls, understanding that we're going over the falls, which might make it a little bit easier, I suppose?
You know, it has interwar, in between conflicts, has really been when the greatest innovation activity has occurred. The scale of innovation occurs generally during the conflict, but the most meaningful. So you take stealth and you take precision. I mean, they were at the end of a conflict and then carried through into the next conflict as significant capabilities. So the question is, what is it we're looking at now that would be fundamentally different, and at what point can you do it? And until you can change the incentive structure, which is what we did with stealth and with precision, the behavior doesn't change in the institution. And so whether it's a conflict or whether it's a lack of resource that gets the behavior to start to really change, rather than I can do this, you know, keep cutting me, I can still do it. Okay, I can't do it anymore. I've got to have a different way of doing business. And if I can't break out before I get to that cliff, I'm in trouble. The question right now is, and that's why I tend to agree with Harlan, is that at 500 billion, do you really have to change your behavior? And we're kind of watching that.
Steve?
I'll just touch on the thread of your question that concerns acquisition and industry. If the first step and the necessary but by no means sufficient step to solving a problem is identifying it and articulating it, I would argue that Frank Kendall and Ash Carter before him have put their finger on the contemporary problem of acquisition and industrial strategy, and that is, simply put, productivity, which again sounds kind of anodyne, except when you juxtapose it against what the sort of reflex about the problem is, which is cost and overcapacity. It interests me when you really read Better Buying Power in both of its iterations. The problem they are calling out for attention to is not so much per se cost, it's productivity. And I know that distinction is only subtle, but it's a subtlety with a significance to it. So for example, whether there will be mergers and acquisitions, I don't think are going to be so much a function of public policy. I don't see necessarily how large and lots of consolidation in this industry of the sort that we saw in the 1990s is valuable. In a marketplace where what the customer wants is not overcapacity, smaller cost. Sure, they want that, but what they identify as the real problem, the imperative, is poor productivity, poor outputs and innovation.
Matt, do you have anything to add?
No.
I disagree with him to some extent.
Well, in that case, go ahead and disagree with
I don't disagree that productivity, et cetera, but what I disagree on is that the leverage in an industrial solution to our problems is just not there. It's at diminishing returns. I mean, you can only do so much with manufacturing, and there are a lot of great initiatives starting to come out of manufacturing. Got you there, but they are not 10x in price. They are not. They are at diminishing returns. And so you have to start to understand how you're going to net this stuff together, get the cognitive power, put the human being in the right place in the chain, and start to leverage this stuff. And that means in the acquisition world, which is my experience, you have to get at the reference architectures. The department has a set of reference architectures that tell industry how they compete. They're all incentivized for the platform and for the platform to be the solution to a problem. That's just not the way you work in the 21st century. That the platform is not, and the platform is too slow to respond to a changing world. And so we've got to figure out not how to compete with computers, but how man, machine, and computational power start to come together in a way that gives you huge leverage. And if you can't get to that, then I worry, because then Dempsey's exactly right. I mean, the difference between breakout and where we are is about one production cycle. That's it.
which is why people ought to be paying much more attention to Mitzi Wertheim as far as I'm concerned. But Barry, do you want to finish it up? Great. Guys, thanks very, very much for joining us. We really appreciate everybody coming out early, and thanks very much to the panel. Thank you.